Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director, and as always, we really appreciate you joining us for today's show. The truth is out there. Historical detectives like Lorine McGinnis Schulze use genealogy to solve mysteries. They hunt down old and often forgotten documents and records, looking for clues and new leads. In this episode, Lorine will share with us some tricks of her trade and 3 of her most intriguing cases involving a missing grandmother, a buried foot, and a photo found lodged in the pages of an old book. But before we get to that, we have made a major announcement since the last episode went out, and I wanted to catch you all up on that. We've unleashed our next paranormal adventure, The Haunting at Black Creek. Contacting the spirit world is not without consequences. Toronto's Black Creek Pioneer Village is famously haunted. Its reputation draws paranormal enthusiasts from all over the world. They come hoping to witness incredible, terrifying, and unexplainable events. No building has played a larger role in that reputation than the 170-year-old halfway house. Our evening begins as we retrace the steps of an ill-fated investigation that went terribly, terribly wrong. We will explore the same darkened hallways and attempt to recreate the events of that night. We hope this time for a much less disturbing result. You don't have to believe in ghosts to be afraid of the haunting at Black Creek. This creepy and unsettling experience is not for the weak, nor recommended for those with health conditions. Due to the very frightening nature of the experience, we require all participants to be 18 plus. Come with an open mind, in the hope that you won't lose yours. We've been working on this experience for quite some time, and I can't wait for us to get started. We will be launching the first weekend of August, and tickets are already going very quickly. So if you are a fan of the horror genre in particular, why go watch a horror movie when you can come live one with us at Black Creek? Tickets for The Haunting at Black Creek or any of our ghost tours or paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto, all of that information can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And don't forget, as an awesome listener of Haunted Talks, you can get a 15% discount on all tickets by using the promo code Haunted Talks at checkout. And we certainly hope that we will be part of your summer plans. We always love to connect with listeners, so if you're on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, check us out at Haunted Walk. If you have been enjoying the episodes, be sure to subscribe to wherever you listen to us, and certainly dropping a 5-star review for the show would be very much appreciated and does a lot of good to help other people learn about the episodes that we're putting out. And of course, if you have friends or family who are interested in the kind of content we cover here, the supernatural, the dark history, please, if they're a podcast listener, recommend Haunted Talks to them. And now, my interview with historical detective Lorine McGinnis Schulze. Let's start with the most basic question to begin our conversation, as we will have listeners who are not familiar with genealogy at all. How would you describe what genealogy is and how it's used?
Well, I guess I would describe it as tracing your ancestors, your family line back in time, starting with yourself and going back through each generation, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on. How you use it, that's actually a very interesting question because you could use it in many different ways. You could simply be interested in your heritage, what made you you. You could be interested in your ethnicity. You could be interested in what your family has done for a living over the centuries. Some people, when they trace their ancestors, they find that there's a history of watchmakers or a history of merchants. And, so some people find that very interesting, and they'll say, oh gosh, my dad was in the same profession. You could also use it if you get into the DNA aspect of it for finding out medical information. And you can find that out too just through genealogy research, through the death records. So there's I'll have to say a zillion ways you can use it.
And it does seem, when we talk about our family histories, often we have kind of the very high overhead, the big picture, I guess, of our families, but it's often those small details you kind of mention of occupations or other notable events that often do fall through the cracks, but are out there for us to kind of find and recover.
That's right. It's, we call it in the genealogy circles, putting flesh on the bones. You can find out when your parents were married or when they were born, or same thing for your grandparents and even further back. But do you know what they did, how they lived their lives? And I think what's often forgotten, even sometimes by genealogists, is that everyone lives, breathes, experiences joy, experiences sadness, and dies. And for me, anyway, I like really finding out, digging deep, doing my detective work as it is, and finding out what was this person really like. As much as possible, I want to know that.
And what was that first kind of moment for you when you felt you were kind of hooked in doing this research?
Actually, it was a very long time ago. I don't want to say how many years, but I will say that when I was 14, my father died very unexpectedly. And he had always talked about wanting to know who his Irish ancestors were because, of course, my maiden name is McGinnis. And so after he died, I was very close to him. So after he died, I just made a little promise to myself that I would find out how you find out about your ancestors so long ago, and that I would find out about his Irish ancestors for him. And I've never stopped since then.
Now, as you mentioned, kind of family mysteries play a big role in genealogy, trying to put the pieces together. And you have a wonderful website, olivetreegenealogy.com, which has a huge number of resources available for genealogists or people looking to do that research. But my favorite part of the site has to be your blog, where you kind of start digging into some of these mysteries. And one of the ones you had on there that caught my attention was about your family, and that had to do with the case of your missing grandmother. And I wonder if you could unfold that story for us.
I knew where my grandmother was buried, so that wasn't a mystery for me, although I'll add to that, I thought I knew where she was buried. When my mother died, and she was going to be interred in Guelph, where all our family has been interred for many hundreds of years, I decided to have my father's ashes reinterred there too. In the course of trying to find a grave plot where I would have permission to put 2 more urns, I had said to the administrators in Guelph at the cemetery, I had said to them, I'd like to have them with my grandmother and grandfather who are buried in such a plot. But the cemetery got back to me and said, no, your grandmother isn't there. And my husband and I took a drive to Guelph, checked the tombstone, and sure enough, her name was not on the tombstone. That started my quest to find out, well, where is she? Why isn't she here? My aunt, who is my grandmother's surviving daughter, insisted that my grandmother was indeed buried there and that she had attended a funeral service for her there. So I put out what I call to the great hive mind of Facebook and Twitter to say, can anyone help me with this? Because I know she died in Owen Sound. Can someone check the Owen Sound cemeteries? Making it a team effort. And everyone pitched in and no one could find her anywhere. Long story short, eventually I thought, okay, I've got to set this aside. I'm not getting anywhere with it. And I'll come back to it at another time. I'll move on to a different project for a while. And then when the interment ceremony took place, or it's not really a ceremony, but when they are reburying the ashes, I was asked if I wanted to be there by the cemetery. And I said, no, it's a long trip for me, so it's fine. You go ahead and do it. And they were burying my father and mother's ashes in the plot with my mother's father, the one where I thought my grandmother was. And then the cemetery called me and they said, you'll never believe this, but while the gentleman was digging the small hole that we do for your dad's and your mom's urns, we discovered your grandmother's urn. It has her name on it, and she's been buried here, but not by us.
Oh, no, okay.
So, yeah. So I was quite astounded, and I was so bewildered. What do you mean? No, this is crazy. And then my aunt, when I told her, she said, oh, well, her husband, my uncle, she said, I gave him mother's urns, meaning my grandmother's, or urn, I should say, and asked him to take it up to the cemetery and have them bury it. And she said, I guess he just went in there in the middle of the night with a shovel and buried it himself.
And have you had a chance to speak with him since?
No, he is long gone.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't. But I at first I was kind of horrified, but then I thought, well, I'm glad he just didn't toss them out into the woods. Let's look on the bright side. It's kind of a way, I think we genealogists tend to be a bit almost superstitious, and I almost feel like my grandmother wanted to be found because that's a very small urn in a very big plot, because my grandfather who was there is in a coffin. He wasn't cremated. And the odds that the groundskeeper would dig at that exact location are, kind of minimal.
And is that something you consider in your work, that kind of serendipity is a big part of it?
Not a big part of it, but I do consider it as part of it. And I know many genealogists do. We genealogists love cemeteries, and we'll often stop at cemeteries just because we want to look around. And sometimes you'll get a real urge. You'll drive by a cemetery and you'll say, oh, I really have to stop here. I just feel like I need to go in. And quite often people will go in and they'll suddenly stumble on a gravestone of an ancestor who they did not know was buried there. So I'm a believer to a point.
Something very interesting you did mention was the idea of the hive mind of the internet being able to help in some of these cases. Do you have any perspective on how genealogy has changed with that type of connectivity and technology? I assume now you could have, as you say, tens or even hundreds of people kind of all working in unison towards one goal, various places around the world using completely different strategies.
Exactly. And what's wonderful about it is more and more records are coming online all the time, being digitized all around the world, making it much easier for genealogists to do their research from a distance. But there's still millions of records that haven't been digitized, and graveyards that haven't been filmed, or pictures haven't been taken and put online. So even just using that as an example, it's wonderful just to put out a call, hey, anyone living over in Belgium or wherever might check their local graveyard for me. I think my, XXX grandfather is buried there, and people just jump in. Every genealogists in general are a very helpful group of people, and they love a challenge and they love a mystery. And they'll dig in and see what they can find, or they'll look in books that maybe you don't have access to. And so that has really changed things. The only caveat that I see there is that sometimes, especially new genealogists, start to assume that either everything is online or they can get all these other people to help them. And there still are things at local archives and libraries and museums that need to be sought out in person. And it's really hard to kind of get that across to a beginning genealogist, because it's so easy for them now to start and actually go quite far on their family tree without leaving their computer chair.
And one of my favorite parts of doing research is when if you're, for example, at the National Archives here, and you have in your hands a letter that, Sir John A. Macdonald wrote, or something to that effect, where you have these real tangible documents. Looking ahead, I guess, to kind of the next generation of genealogists, I'm vaguely concerned that with a lot more of our records being digital instead of physical copies of things. Does that provide any concern for genealogists of the future? Is there going to be more information available through the digital means, or are we actually going to have kind of less stuff we can go back and track down?
I think we'll have less original documents such as letters. I have another website called Past Voices, and it's full of letters that were written back in the 1800s. And those really aren't going to be available much anymore. I mean, who writes a hand letter and sticks it in the post office to be mailed? Not many people. Either we email or we text, and those aren't going to be accessible, I don't believe, in 100 years, because technology, as you said, technology changes everything. And also, your point about when you actually see that original image, or if you're lucky enough, you get to hold it in your hand. If you're really interested in history or genealogy and it really speaks to you, it's such an overwhelming, powerful moment to see that or hold it. And I think that is going to be lost to a great part. And the same with photos. I mean, we all take tons of photos on our cell phones, but do we print them? Do we frame them? No, probably not. So I think that will be a loss that will be felt in the future.
Now, we've been discussing some kind of family mysteries, but there's also kind of larger historical mysteries, and not so much, how did the Egyptians build the pyramids, but more kind of personal histories and trying to solve certain cases. And one of your blog posts has to do with the burial of a human foot, which I think our audience might enjoy hearing about. So could you tell us the story of Hilda's foot?
Hilda's foot was an interesting little tidbit that came my way. A friend of mine had posted an image of a burial card from a cemetery, and all the burial card said was the date and that Hilda's foot had been buried that day, and it gave Hilda's surname.
Just the foot.
Just the foot. So the question was, have any other genealogists ever seen anything like this? Just a foot being buried? My friend asked, great hive mind, can people jump in and help out here either with ideas or do some research? So I did some research, and I found a newspaper article about Hilda and her foot, and she had been run over by a streetcar, and her leg actually had to be amputated. I think it was from the knee down. And then she was suing the streetcar company, and I believe the city too. And for some reason, she had her amputated leg and foot buried. So that was another mystery. Why would she have it buried? Maybe it was to substantiate the claim that her foot was amputated. Who knows? That remained a mystery. But I got so interested, I thought, well, I want to find out what happened to Hilda and the rest of her. Mm-hmm. When eventually she would have died, and why isn't she buried with her leg? So I did trace her and her husband and the family, and nothing interesting in their lives, but at the end she was buried in a completely separate state than where her foot was. I have no answers. It remains a mystery as to why. All I can think of is that perhaps she did just have the leg buried as some kind of proof that, I really did lose my leg because of what your streetcar driver did.
And I think I read there was a lawsuit involved of some sort?
Yes, she sued the streetcar company, and I think she sued the city. I wrote that one some time ago, so I just can't quite remember the detail on that. But I never could find out what exactly happened with the lawsuit. I checked the various newspapers and such, and I just couldn't find anything.
So she's a woman essentially buried in two places at once.
In two places. And my other curiosity is, and I didn't actually have time to check into this, is there anything marking her foot? And if so, what does the tombstone say? Here lies Hilda's foot, or I don't know.
That's a great question.
Yeah, I would really like to know. Or is it just in an unmarked plot?
And that seems to be one thing, doing this type of historical detective work. You can often start down one path or think there's one certain answer, but often it just seems more and more questions kind of get raised as you get deeper into it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We call it going down the rabbit hole. And it's easy to get sidetracked because you'll be studying a record and you'll suddenly realize, ooh, this is a really interesting little tidbit of information here. Here's something that's an anomaly. It doesn't fit with what I know of the family. And then you just jump into that and you forget about what what your original goal was. And it can be a very interesting maze of questions and answers and mysteries. Some never get solved, unfortunately. And some can take years. But that's for me anyway, and I think for a lot of genealogists, perhaps most of them, that's the fun of genealogy, is all the mysteries.
Now, it does seem genealogy is being used more and more, particularly the DNA side, in an attempt to solve particularly unsolved murders or crimes of some nature. I'm curious if you had any thoughts on that. I know obviously it's an incredible tool. I believe it was the Golden State killer that was tracked down that way, as well as they've done some work with the Bear Brook case, if anyone's familiar with that one. But for people who aren't sure kind of how that works, how does genealogy and DNA kind of fit into solving crimes?
What's been happening is police departments around the world have suddenly realized that there are all these databases online that are full of people who have submitted their DNA, including me, to various companies. And usually we submit them to more than one because every algorithm that's run by each company is slightly different. And normally we submit our DNA because of two reasons. We want to find out our further back ethnicity. And we also want to make connections with other people whose DNA says, hey, this is a cousin of some sort, maybe a fifth cousin, maybe a second cousin, because that person might have the answers that we need to trace our line back further. So somewhere, somehow, someone in the police department realized, hey, there's all these databases of DNA out there. And if we have DNA from a cold case, we could submit it to the same company and see who we match. So they can't see your DNA, but they can submit their own kit. And then it will come up and it'll say, oh, gee, you match these, whatever. It'll be hundreds of people. You match these hundreds of people. And then they can get a genetic genealogist to track it all, someone who specializes in that, and come up with a family tree going down the generations until they come up with anywhere maybe up to a dozen or so people that are a fairly close match to the killer DNA. And then from there, they can investigate the people and they can narrow it down even more, which is exactly how we do it when we're not doing it to find a killer, when we're just doing it to figure out, how is this person who the DNA company tells me is probably a third cousin, but I don't know them. I have to get in touch with them and see if we can figure out who's the common ancestor. So I'm sort of going backwards, whereas the police departments are coming down. There's a lot of controversy over it in the genealogy community, and some are dead set against it, and others, like me, I'm fine with it. I'm for it. So the companies now are setting it up that you can opt in or opt out to allow law enforcement to use your DNA results. Like either use it or don't use it.
So essentially for the police then, it's kind of like if the case is a needle in a haystack where they really have no good leads on who may have committed a crime, it does kind of narrow that haystack down to a more manageable level. And in a concrete level, it's this person is related to this person in some degree. So if you can trace back a relative to being in that place at that time, suddenly they become a very interesting suspect.
That's right. Or they may even have a suspect, but they're not positive, and they can trace it back that way and narrow the field, as you said. Yeah, so it's a very important tool for them. I think it's good because it'd be nice if you could give a family closure. That the person guilty of committing some horrible crime against a family member of theirs has been found.
Now, one of the fun parts about solving these historical mysteries, particularly ones that aren't these major stories, but are just trying to find the answer for yourself almost, and sometimes you can share that answer with the loved ones of the subject of the investigation. And you recently posted a story on the blog, which is exactly the type of thing that gets me very interested. And that has to do with someone who found in an old book a photograph. And then you began kind of tracing who's the photograph of, what's their story, and then obviously trying to think about, well, who would have put this old photograph in this old book? And you had a great title for that called A Death Too Young. And I'm wondering if you can kind of walk us through that case, which really did kind of lead you down some different paths from what you initially started.
Yes, someone who I follow on Twitter had posted a picture of a young soldier. And I'm very big on military photos. And years ago, young men going off to war. And in fact, I have something on my blog that people send me pictures of soldiers' dog tags that they have either discovered in antique shops or they've dug up in their backyard. And we, meaning the hive mind, and we try to find a descendant that the dog tag can be sent to. So I really have quite a passion for that. So when I saw this picture of this young soldier come up on Twitter, and the gentleman said, "Oh, it fell out of an old book I just bought," and on the back he's written a little note, the soldier, and signed it with his name. Wish I knew more about him, that type of thing. So I asked his permission to publish it on my blog and write about it. And it really was a fascinating, to me, story, because I felt very sad as I was writing it, but at the same time I felt good that I'm giving this young man a bit of a voice.
Sure. He's
not going to be forgotten.
Were there any clues about the particular book it was in?
I actually wrote to Stephen, the man on Twitter, afterwards and asked him as I started the research and said, "Can you tell me more about the book?" And he did tell me, but it was a very long, very academic title.
Okay.
And he described the book to me, and it was obvious that the book was something that would have been purchased by a family that had some money. It had a special leather binding and gilt edges. And the title of the book was called King Edward's Realm. Just not something that everyone would have in their bookcase.
And was it old, or?
Yes, he said it was probably middle 1800s, I believe.
Okay, interesting.
Now, this photo was World War I,
yep.
So the early 1900s. But as I researched this man, Arthur, it turned out that he was killed at Gallipoli, which was, if you're a military buff, your ears would perk up, because that's a very horrendous and famous battle that took place over in Turkey. It was Australia with Turkey, and many men died there, and he was one of the ones who died, and that got me even more interested. And then I found mentions of his death in the local newspapers in England where he had lived, and his family and he seemed very well thought of, that they were a really good family, and he was a teacher and helped out in the church and very well thought of. And then, surprisingly, there was even a letter from a man who was with him when he died. And this man had written home to his parents and talked a little bit about the death. And so that was published in the paper too. And these are the kinds of little gems that you have no idea you're going to find, when you're researching.
And how did he die?
There was a bombardment, and a shell burst right near him, and he was killed by the shrapnel. And the man who was next to him wasn't hurt at all, and he's the one who wrote home to tell his mom and dad about the death. Well, that's another example of finding the details if you can, just sticking to it and looking. And you won't always find them, but that was a stroke of luck.
And what was his full name?
Alfred Richard Cousins, and he was from Bedfordshire.
And how old was he when he passed away?
Very young. I know he was early 20s. Anyway, I got so interested. I mean, that seemed like the end of poor Alfred's story, but I thought, well, I'd really like to, if there's any descendants, they might like to know the story and see the photo. And obviously I can't give it to them. It's not mine, but there's a nice reproduction here on the blog that they can download and keep. So I just continued searching Alfred's family, and he had a brother and sister, and I just continued searching each of them, coming down the generations, trying to find a descendant. It's a 4-part series, actually, and 3 of the parts have been published already, and the 4th part is coming out in a couple of days with the end result of my findings.
And can you give us a little preview of those next kind of parts? Where did the story kind of take you next as you continued on?
Well, I started researching his brother Alfred and found out that Alfred was perhaps a little bit of a wild one and was sometimes in a little bit of trouble. And then I believe it was about 1921 that Arthur, the brother, had been sued by a woman for child support. She claimed that her son was his son. And he had, and this was all in the newspapers, and Arthur had agreed that yes, it was his son. But then later he changed his mind and fought it and said that it wasn't his son. And this went on for quite some time. I'm quite sure it was his son because the illegitimate boy was given Alfred's last name. Also, it was kind of obvious if he agreed the first time to pay the support payments, he was obviously admitting that was his son. And then I decided, okay, I'll just leave that for a bit. And then I researched the sister, Elsie. I wanted to see if she married and had children. She did marry. She didn't have any children, so that, petered out as trying to find a descendant. And when I went back to Arthur, the brother of the young soldier, I found out that he actually ended up marrying not the girl who he had his illegitimate son, but he did marry and did not have any children with his next wife. So I will give away the end part of the ending, and part of the ending is that there was only one descendant, and that was the illegitimate son.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that made me feel a bit sad, especially because it was really obvious that his biological father, Arthur, had never acknowledged him as his son, and they did not have a relationship as adults. A little bit of sadness there, but I haven't researched it any further, so I'm hoping that the boy had descendants and that maybe they'll find the story and see the picture of their grandfather's uncle.
Yeah, and please keep us up to date on that if you are able to do that, because that would certainly be one more twist in the story.
Yes, and usually what I do if I do have time and I go on and find that, or somebody pops up and writes to me and says, oh my gosh, I'm the grandson of the illegitimate boy, I usually write another article or an update, because that for me is part of the fun, is making those connections.
And do you find people are genuinely excited or happy to talk to you when you have some information or photos or documents that you want to share with them? Are people usually very receptive to that kind of thing?
Yes, very, very receptive. They're usually quite thrilled, and I have yet another website called Lost Faces. I'm an antique collector, and one of my hobbies is collecting photo albums from the Civil War period, and I like to collect them where the majority of photos have been identified, and then I research the names of those people in the photos, and then my husband scans them all for me, and I put them all online on my website. I don't always put the research up because that would be a lot, but I put up the photos with the names, and I just invite people, download the photo, and if it's your grandfather, great-grandfather, whatever, and people will often contact me and, ask, can I buy the whole album? Can I buy the photo? Or, is there anything else? Do you have any documents on the family? So they're quite excited, just as I would be if I found someone had a photo album of one of my ancestors. I'd be thrilled, and I'd probably want to pay heaven and earth for it.
Now, I'm sure after listening to, some of your adventures here and your historical detective work, or just family genealogy, I'm sure some of our listeners are getting a little bit of an itch themselves to try their hand at doing this kind of research. I wonder if there's any kind of, entry-level tips you could give to our listeners if they're going to start, working on their family tree or investigating some historical person, event, or document.
Mm-hmm. Well, if they're starting with themselves because they want to do their family tree, they need to do just that. Start with themselves and work backwards one generation at a time. I would recommend anyway that they first talk to anyone in the family who is still living, who can fill them in on some details. And they should keep a little notebook and write this down, what did your grandmother tell you? And they can ask them questions such as, where were you born? When were you born? Where did you live? A lot of basic questions that might not seem too interesting at first, but those are the building blocks. You need the dates and you need locations in order to go further and to find out details about the person. And so then once they've spoken to living family members, then they should, in my suggestion, my recommendation is that then they venture into actually searching out the basic documents such as birth, marriage, death, census records. And they need to go slowly and be really methodical and be patient, because at first they're just going to get what might seem like very boring dates, dates and locations. And they might be thinking, when does the exciting stuff happen? But it's just like when we're babies and we have to learn to crawl before we walk and walk before we run. And they've got to get all these first or they'll be lost. And then they can go, for more obscure records, they can look for journals or assessment records or voter slips. And the way to find out what's available in the area you're searching and the time period you're searching is to go online to a local archives and see what records they have, what records are available, because not all records have been saved. Some have been lost, some were never kept. And it's really important to try to stay focused on what they're searching, try not to go down the rabbit holes, but it is really fun to go down those rabbit holes. So if they want to, a good idea is to just write down either go down the rabbit hole, but write down what your original task was so you can come back to it later, because you will forget. Or don't go down that rabbit hole, but write down what the rabbit hole is and continue on your focused path and then go back and do the rabbit hole. So it's a matter of keeping a lot of notes. Write down what you found, write down what you looked in, what you didn't find, and talk to people. Talk to people on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, whatever social media site you're on. And you can even write to genealogists that have websites like me. I usually will answer. And if you keep your question really brief, you'll probably get a bit of an answer. They'll learn as they go along. And basically, it fits in with you. Genealogy is a mystery, and they are the detectives solving it.
The big name on the block right now is Ancestry, which is online. Is that a place you'd recommend people start? I guess, what do you think just about that tool in general? Is it's one that's, quite pervasive?
I'll tell you honestly, I use Ancestry all the time because for me, they have the most comprehensive sets of records. They have not everything I need because it depends what location you're looking in. For my English ancestors, I use, I'm giving all these guys as free publicity, but I use Find My Past and the British newspapers for my English ancestors. If I had Scottish ancestors, which I don't, I would be using Scotland's People. And for just the sort of generic, North American and some English and a smattering of this, that, and the other thing, Ancestry, far and away, is your best bet, especially for, I think, a newcomer. But I use it. I use it almost daily.
That's interesting. I use it quite a bit in research as well. I mean, just, there's often the game of trying to find, if there's a relative, a descendant, if I'm doing a podcast for something, and I want to talk to see how a story has been passed down through the family. But I think you're absolutely right. You can easily spend a few hours on there if you're not very careful, because there's just so much.
Yeah, exactly. And you can still, they're expensive to belong to, but you can still find a lot of free sites, like mine, like Olive Tree Genealogy. I do have a lot of data online. It's hit or miss whether you would find an ancestor there, but you might. And it's all free. There's never a charge. And there are other sites like that, and so it's a matter of just kind of, and maybe joining some groups. You can join some Facebook groups and ask. Like one example is there's a Facebook group just for Ontario. So people can join that and they can say, hey, I'm new. Where should I be looking? and everyone will jump in and help them. And I run a Facebook group just specifically for New Netherland, which is one of my focus areas, which New Netherland became New York State. And I run a Facebook group just for that. So anyone that found out they had an ancestor in New Netherland could go and join that group and start asking questions. So, it's a matter of looking around. What groups can I join? What's out there? They'll find very helpful people.
It does seem like there's a real community aspect to it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, before we let you go, Lorine, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, but I can't let you go without asking you about one of your other projects, which you've gotten involved with, and that's writing fictional books about, of course, a genealogist who's solving mysteries. I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit. I guess there's one book out and another one in the works.
Coming soon.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing on the fictional side and why you're doing it.
I've always written nonfiction books for a long time. Stories of settlers coming into New Netherland or stories of settlers in Ontario. And I've written help books like using Evernote for genealogy, finding a loyalist in Ontario, etc. But I've always wanted to write a mystery book. And about, 6 or 7 years ago, I thought, well, I'm just doing it. And what better person to write about than a genealogist, a female in her 50s, who, as she's going around doing her genealogy research in various cities and places, she's always stumbling on murders and dead bodies. She's a bit of an independent spirit, bit of an adventurer, and she just gets herself involved in all these things. So my first book took me a long time because it turned out to be much more difficult than I thought it would be to write a mystery and, keep it all straight and not give too many clues at first. So it took me quite a while to write it. So my first book, which took several years to write, came out about 3 years ago, and it's called Death Finds a Way, a Janie Riley Mystery. And my second book that I'm almost finished is called A Grave Secret, a Janie Riley Mystery. And my hope is to do a series of them. And the first book that came out was set in Salt Lake City, which is the mecca for genealogists in Utah. My second book is actually set in England. It's a made-up name for a real village in England, which is considered the most haunted village in England.
Okay.
And that's where A Grave Secret, the one I'm working on now, that's where it takes place. And I just invented a new name because I don't want to use the name of the real village and, maybe have the people living there angry with me or something.
Well, that certainly sounds right up our alley. A good ghost story.
Yeah, there's lots of ghosts in it.
And the Death Finds a Way is available on Amazon?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, either as an ebook or a paperback. Yeah, and I'm very excited about continuing on with this, and I hope to get a little faster at getting them done. But I won't sacrifice, what for me it has to be quality, and I'm not sacrificing that for speed, but I think I just need to be a bit more efficient in my time.
So you can find the book on Amazon. Hopefully the new book will be there in a little bit. We'll look for that as well. The website is olivetreegenealogy.com. And Lorine, if people are interested in following you, are you on other social platforms as well?
Yes, I'm on all of them. You can find me on Twitter. I think you can search under Olive Tree Genealogy, but my handle is Lorine MS, the initials for my McGinnis Schulze surname.
And that's spelled LORINEMS.
And on Facebook, you can definitely find me under either Olive Tree Genealogy or Lorine McGinnis Schulze. And I do have a Facebook page for Olive Tree Genealogy. And I'm also on Instagram. I don't post there that much, but I am on Instagram, again, as Olive Tree Genealogy.
I really enjoyed having the opportunity to speak with Lorine, and I'd highly encourage you to check out her website, olivetreegenealogy.com, if you're at all interested in this area. She has so many resources on there, and she's also written a number of books that could be extremely useful and helpful to you. If you have solved a mystery in your own family's background, I would certainly love to hear about it. I love this stuff. So please, feel free to reach out to me with that, or of course, if you have any show ideas or comments, my email is jim@hauntedwalk.com. Information about all our ghost tours and paranormal adventures, including the brand new, soon to start Haunting at Black Creek, can all be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And don't forget to use that Haunted Talks promo code at checkout so you can get 15% off. As always, thank you to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our amazing audio editor, and Kevin McLeod at Incompetech.com for the additional music. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.